Before we set up the purchase order workflow, there are certain parameters we must configure before we start configuring the purchase order workflow, and these parameters can be found under the system administration module under the setup, expand the workflow menu, and then workflow parameters. Here we have a checkbox called disallow approval by submitter. In our case, we will keep this unchecked because in our case the user who submits the workflow is the same user who can approve the workflow. We must deselect this, and we must run this workflow infrastructure configuration, which will create a batch job template in the background to process the workflow related jobs. Let us see how to create a simple purchase order workflow. In order to create a purchase order workflow, navigate to procurement and sourcing. Under the setup, click on procurement and sourcing workflow. In order to create a new workflow, click on new. Here we have a readily available templates. We can choose the one of the template to create a purchase order workflow, and for our case we will select the template purchase order workflow and click on create workflow. This will open up the workflow editor window and we can start configuring the workflow here. We are going to create a very simple workflow where we will just introduce a approval status, so user can submit the purchase order for review and which requires approval. Once it is approved, we can confirm the purchase order and proceed it further. So here we have a two-stage start, and if we go little down, we have an end stage. We will little zoom out so that we can see both the stage, and we will add one more stage in between, and that's about approval. Click on approve purchase order. This will come by default when we use a purchase order workflow template, so we can edit here. Just simply drag and drop here, and as a next step we can establish a link here. So from start to approval, and from approval to end. Click on this workflow window and then click on properties as a next step. Here we need to set some basic properties. We can give a description about the workflow, and that is we leave it as it is, purchase order workflow, and some instruction which will be required to give as a submission instructions. We can say please approve purchase order. Under the activation tab we leave as it is, and notification tab we leave as it is, and not stop. We will just review the bare minimum settings which we need to configure to have the purchase order workflow configured. Then as a next step, click on approval. We can double click and that will take us to the detail. Here we can configure the approval stages. We can have a one-step approval, two-step approval, and likewise we can add the number of steps as many required. For now we will configure the single step approval. So here we have step 1. Right click and say properties. Alternatively, we can also access the properties from here. Here we say step 1. Here you can write the work item subject, PO approval, and here work item instruction. Please review and approve PO. Here we can do assignment, and here we select the user. Under the user, select the user to which we would like to assign. So in this case I am selecting the user which I am logging with, that's Rahul.s. Here we can set the time limit, and that is 1 day by default. We leave it as it is, and we can also configure the completion policy, whether it's a single approver or all approver. So for now we leave it as it is because here we have only one user for approval. We don't have any condition and escalation, and we under the condition we always want to run this tab. So that's it, and we are done. As we can see that as and when we set up the required things, the error message and warning message will disappear from this pane. Make sure that there are no pending error message here in order to proceed. And once we are done with this, we can go back to workflow here and click on approval window and configure some properties here for approval. So here we make it as a approve purchase order, and we leave other settings as it is, so that just description. And under the notification, we can set the notification when notification to be sent, but for now we leave it as it is. Under the advanced settings, here we can select all the actions which are possible for a particular purchase order. So user should be able to approve, reject, request change and delegate. So we leave all actions enable, and also we disable for enterprise portal. This is an option set, but for now we'll disable it. And once we are done with all these changes, we can save and close. And here we can give a brief version notes. That's simple. PO approval workflow, and click OK. Select the activate the new version, otherwise it will create a new version, but will not activate the new version. So choose this option when you want to activate the new version and click OK. This will save the workflow and get this workflow activated so that we can use it for our change management purpose or purchase order workflow process. Here we can see that this workflow is now activated. So this is how we can set up a simple purchase order workflow. This is required for the change management process as well. If we would like to enable the change management, we need to have one purchase order workflow activated. Hi. Once the purchase order workflow has been set up, as the next step we can enable the change management process. In order to enable this change management process, please navigate to procurement and sourcing. Under the setup, click on procurement and sourcing parameters. Here under the general tab, here we have a change management for purchase orders field group. Under that we have two checkboxes. In order to activate the change management for all vendors, we should select activate change management checkbox. However, we also have an option to enable it for specific vendors. So in order to activate change management for a specific vendor, click allow override of settings per vendor. The difference between these two checkboxes is when we activate change management, it is activated irrespective of vendor and it's applicable for all vendors. However, with the allow override of settings per vendor, we would be able to activate it for vendors of our choice. So let's review how we can override these settings for a particular vendor. First of all, locate the vendors form, and that can be located under procurement and sourcing under the common. Under the vendors menu, click on all vendors. Here you can select the vendor for which we would like to enable the change management, say 1001, that's a crystal cables, and then click on edit. Under the purchase order default fast tab, under the change management for purchase order field group, we have a override settings checkbox. If you would like to override the change management for this particular vendor, we can set override settings here, and then these two checkbox will also get enabled. In order to deactivate the change management for this particular vendor, uncheck this active change management checkbox. If we allow override of settings per purchase order, when we create a purchase order for this particular vendor 1001, we can decide whether to keep change management activated for that particular purchase order or not. So we will also review that. For now I am unchecking and I am activating the change management for this particular vendor 1001. Then as the next step, let's try creating a purchase order. So in order to create a purchase order, I will directly go it from here. Under the procurement, click on purchase order. And as we can see that there is a yellow bar highlighted, and that shows that purchase order workflow is activated. As the next step, we can enter the item number. Then as the next step, let's add one or more purchase order lines. We will select this item, let's say home theater system, and we leave the quantity and other details as it is. We need to fill in the configuration because that is activated, and then save the purchase order line. And as we can see, as a next step, we need to submit this workflow within a hierarchy, and we are seeing this yellow bar because change management is activated. So when change management is activated, we need to follow the hierarchy as per the workflow setup. So as a next step, I can submit this purchase order for review and approval to a higher authority. So I will click on submit, and here I can write down some comments. approve this PO and click on submit. If we go back to the detail view, so as soon as we submit the purchase order for approval, the approval status gets in review and order status is still open order. Here I have certain actions which I can take on this purchase order based on the user rights or based on the options enabled for this particular user. So since I submitted, I have two options: either recall this submission or look at the view history. First we look at the view history, and here we can see that this is the workflow which has been submitted and which has been assigned to user Adam Bar for review. So we can either recall the submission from here and resubmit it. We can wait for user Adam to approve this purchase order. However, in this case, the user who submits and who approves is the same. So with the same user, we can also approve the purchase order. So let's go to the action pane. Actually, in the back, when we submit the workflow, in a background workflow batch will be created. Based on the recurrence frequency of the page job, the workflow job will be processed. So I assume that now other actions are enabled. So I just refresh this work page. So now I can see that additional actions are available. So I can either approve or reject this request, or request for change, or delegate it to someone else for approval and review. So Adam is the user who has submitted, so he can also recall these changes. So for now I will just approve and write down some comments here. And click on approve, and then approval status will change to approved. As soon as we approve this purchase order in a workflow, it will create a batch job which will take some time to get processed. So we can keep on refreshing and it will get the status approved. And then as a next step, we can confirm the purchase order and process it as usual. So this is how we can use change management process to bring in tighter control in a purchase order process. This may be required because we have a frequent complaints from the customer when we purchase from this particular set of vendors. Let's refresh and let's see. As we can see now, approval status is changed to approve. So as a next step, we can confirm this purchase order and then proceed it as usual. Now as a next step, we will create a purchase order manually for this same vendor 1001, and under this administration, here we have a checkbox activate change management, which is selected by default, and that's because change management is activated on a vendor level. However, if you would like to control change management at a purchase order level for a particular vendor, we need to override the settings on a vendor form. So we go back to vendor form, and here we say allow override of settings for purchase order. That means we can determine whenever we create a purchase order for this vendor whether to keep change management activated for this particular purchase order or not. So let's try creating a purchase order again for this vendor. And select the vendor as 1001. Under the administration first step, here now we can see that activate change management box is enabled and we can edit it. So if we uncheck, then for this particular purchase order, this change management will not be activated. Click on OK, and we can see that when purchase order is created without change management, the default status is approved. However, when change management is activated, the default status is draft. So this is how change management works. Thank you for watching this video.